Hi, my name is Eugenie Officer, and I am a Content Marketing Program Manager at FCC. I will be hosting today's event along with Des Sobel, Deputy Chief Economist at FCC. Today, I am joining you from Montreal, Quebec, and I do want to acknowledge that Montreal is the traditional and unceded territory of the Mohawk and Algonquin peoples. It is a place that has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst nations. Wherever we find ourselves today in Canada, we are on traditional Indigenous territories filled with rich traditions, stories, and histories that should be understood and honored. It is our commitment in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration to honor these peoples as a vital contributor to our society and respect the diversity and strength of all Indigenous peoples across this country. Hi, Des. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Eugenie. It's great to be here.
All right, so let's dive right in. Food inflation has been a hot topic for the past few years, and the number of people that are facing food insecurity in Canada and around the world is increasing. What are some key trends, and what can consumers expect in the year ahead for food prices?
Thanks, Eugenie. Yes, let's first start off from the 35,000-foot vantage point. There are certainly a couple of key trends that will dictate how food and beverage manufacturers will perform this year and what consumers can anticipate when grocery shopping. The first is consumers' shopping habits are changing. High inflation over the past 2 years, or really since before the pandemic, has resulted in grocery prices increasing about 22%. This, combined with the corresponding interest rate increases meant to combat inflation, are stretching household budgets. As well, the massive amount of savings accumulating during the pandemic have largely been spent, and household budgets have tightened amid a slowing economy, which has resulted in debt servicing levels as a percentage of disposable income being at a record high. All told, this has left less money for consumers to spend on discretionary and higher priced items. As well, many consumers say the high impact of interest rates are just beginning to affect their spending. What has been surprising in this past year, however, is Canadians on average have spent less on food and beverages. However, there's a lot to unpack with this observation. As I mentioned, Canadians were flush with cash during the pandemic as restrictions and lockdowns limited spending options. With households not being able to go out to eat as much, many started consuming more food at home or entertaining with their bubble cohorts, so spending money at grocery stores increased. As you can see on the screen, in 2020 alone, per capita food and beverage expenditures at grocery stores jumped 6.4% year over year. To put that in context, in the 15 years prior to the pandemic, per capita food expenditures at grocery stores increased by only about 0.5% per year on average. The average amount spent on food in 2021 relative to the large increase in 2020 was still 5.3% higher than in 2019. But by 2023, the average amount spent on food and beverages fell to the lowest point since 2013. And we've seen similar trends in the bar and restaurant space. Per capita spending has rebounded since the steep decline at the onset of the pandemic, but is now only back to levels observed nearly a decade ago. This is primarily due to the increased spending at grocery stores, as there is still significantly less spending at bars and pubs, which haven't fully recovered from the pandemic. Per capita spending at bars and pubs was 21% lower last year than compared to 2019. But to be clear, spending more or less on food doesn't necessarily mean people are purchasing more or less food, though it doesn't exclude that as a possibility. Changing shopping habits need to be considered as well. As food prices kept rising in the past couple of years, consumers began buying more sale items, purchasing less expensive brands, shopping more often at low-cost retailers, and yes, even cutting back on the amount of food purchased. However, changing shopping habits doesn't necessarily mean reduced opportunities for food and beverage manufacturers. According to the International Food Information Council, when asked about what influenced a consumer's decision to purchase a food product last year, taste still remained the top consideration. Price was the second consideration, although the share of respondents listing price as a factor has increased since 2021. As well, Canada's growing and increasingly diverse population is providing additional opportunities. Canada's population last year was estimated at just over 40 million people. As you can see on the screen, over 1 million people entered the country in the first 9 months of last year. In fact, in the period between July 1st and October 1st, That was the fastest growth rate of Canada's population since 1957. That's a lot more mouths to feed. And in effect, population growth is putting a floor under food sales. In addition, with the vast majority of population growth stemming from international immigration, the food preferences of the country are becoming more diverse, offering opportunities to food manufacturers to serve niche but growing market segments.
Wow, there's definitely a lot to consider with what's going on in the food and beverage sectors. With everything you've mentioned here, what does this all mean for this year?
Agreed, that is a lot to consider, and it does have an impact on our forecast for this year. As you can see on the screen, we are projecting food and beverage manufacturing sales to actually fall 1.4% this year from just under $165 billion to $162.6 billion. However, we need to highlight that the growth rates for the last 3 years reflect nominal sales growth, means it includes the impact of inflation. So the exceptional growth rates of the last 3 years, particularly the double-digit growth rates in 21 and 22, were largely fueled by inflation and not due to increased volumes. This is particularly true for a couple of key manufacturing sectors, namely grain and oilseed milling and meat product manufacturing, which we'll get into shortly. In 2023, input costs began to stabilize and in some cases outright decline. Many commodity prices are significantly lower today than they have been in the last 2 years. Fuel and transportation costs are lower, packaging cost growth has slowed, and we expect these trends to continue this year. Wage growth has remained hot, although the following job vacancy rate suggests a moderation is in the cards later this year. There is uniqueness in the food and beverage manufacturing space with respect to employment. The concentration of employment is more dispersed across the country and is often located in more rural areas, making recruitment and retention more challenging. Higher wages are one recruitment tool employers can use. And as you can see on the screen, we saw significant wage growth across nearly all sectors covering the report. Wages offered by grain and oilseed millers grew 18.5% last year, the most of any sector, followed by the beverage manufacturers at 17.9%. Wage growth in the latter is one of the reasons we saw compressed margins last year. One thing to note is that there wasn't enough data to actually support the calculation for sugar and confectionery manufacturers in 2023. This year, wage growth pressures should ease given the reduction in the job vacancy rate. The slide on the screen shows that the relationship between vacancy rate and wage growth is correlated. As the vacancy rate began to increase in 2020 and 2021, so did wage growth, with the vacancy rate returning to pre-pandemic levels in late 2023. We should see overall wage growth in food manufacturing ease. Again, this won't be the case across all sectors because of the geography and rural recruitment considerations we mentioned, amongst other reasons. So if you take all this information and translate it into impacts on profitability, you can see on the screen our forecasts for the gross margin index for the entire food and beverage sector. To be clear, the index does not indicate whether there is profit or loss, but it does allow us to see trends over time with respect to gross profitability. For 2024, we're projecting gross margins to improve slightly, up 1.7% on average. All told, the decline in input costs will be larger than the increase in wages, providing a small boost to margins this year. Keep in mind, the margin estimates vary greatly across sectors. Some will perform better than average, and others will perform worse.
So while there is some improvement, this year will be another tight year for food manufacturers compared to what they experienced a few years ago. The good news is that it seems like we're starting to turn a corner. And looking further down the food supply chain, what does this all mean for the average consumer?
Great question. And this is definitely the one hot topic area we often get asked about. As you can see on the screen, we're expecting food inflation to ease significantly through this year. Already, food inflation has slowed from its peak from just over a year ago, and the most recent consumer price index release from February showed the year-over-year grocery price increase was 2.4%, the lowest since July of 2021. Our estimates are currently showing that as early as spring, food inflation will fall below 2% and will hover around the 1% to 2% rate for the remainder of the year. Beyond that, we expect food inflation to fall in line with the 5-year pre-pandemic average of roughly 2%. This slowdown will definitely provide relief to consumers across the country, but it doesn't mean that groceries will be cheaper. It just means we won't see the significant increases we've seen in the last 3 years.
Well, that will be a welcome relief to consumers, including you and I.
Totally agree.
So that's kind of the high level picture of the overall sector. Now let's turn our attention to the specific manufacturing sectors. There's a wide range of diversity when it comes to food and beverage manufacturing in Canada in terms of the food produced. So let's take some time to unpack them briefly one at a time, as there are a total of 8 covered in this report. So let's kick things off now with the grain and oilseeds milling sector. Many crop prices, such as wheat, canola, and soybeans, have fallen significantly from their highs in 2022. What will the impact be on the millers and crushers?
Yeah. Arguably, the impact of the inflation-fueled sales boom in 2021 and 2022 showed up nowhere more than in the grain and oilseed milling sector. In 2021, sales grew 38.9%, but sales measured in volumes only increased 5%, with a similar phenomenon having occurred in 2022. Last year, this trend actually reversed, with volumes increasing faster than sales. Last year, flour milling and oilseed crushing volumes were at record levels. Grain and oilseed milling has been quite profitable in the last few years, and this year looks to be promising as well, given the lower commodity prices and increased demand for biofuel and renewable diesel in North America. Globally, roughly 70% of canola is still consumed as food, but each year, more is being diverted to industrial use, primarily as biofuel feedstock. 3 of the 5 planned canola crush plants in Saskatchewan are currently under construction, and 2 more are expected to be completed this year. As you can see on the screen, these plants will add another 2.2 million metric tons, or 17% increase of crush capacity. Beyond that, there's another 5.8 million metric tons of capacity that have been announced, but the completion dates are still to be determined. So overall, given the increase in demand for flour and vegetable oil, we expect margins to improve this year. In addition, the expansion of crush capacity is great news for the processing side and for producers. Increased local demand for oilseeds will support prices, and the more value-added processing that Canada does domestically only benefits our economy.
Let's now turn our attention to a sector that I really enjoy, as I do have a sweet tooth: the sugar and confectionery products.
Yeah, I have a sweet tooth as well. Although it has been a couple lean years for this sector. Last year, a lot of focus was on the price of sugar. Global sugar prices rose to their highest level since 2011, mainly due to lower global supplies after unusually dry weather damaged sugarcane harvests in India and Thailand, the world's second and third largest sugar producers. Both countries now have export restrictions in place that are expected to extend through this year. While sugar prices have eased somewhat from their highs last year, they still remain elevated. Brazil, the world's largest sugarcane producer, is expecting a very strong crop this year, which should put downward pressure on prices. But there could be logistic challenges getting the product out of the country, given the high production of other major crops produced in that region. Also, let's not forget about the labor disruption this past year in Western Canada that impacted both the availability and price of sugar, which only compounded what was happening globally. This year, however, the focus is on cocoa. As you can see on the screen, cocoa prices hit a high in 2023, a level which has not been seen in 46 years, and prices continue to accelerate. The Ivory Coast and Ghana are the world's largest cocoa producers, accounting for a combined 58% of global production. And both countries were impacted by El Niño last year, limiting the region's production. These production challenges don't appear to be waning either, and future markets are pricing this in, with cocoa futures up nearly 95% since January 1st alone. Manufacturers will have to absorb some of these increases, as tighter household budgets limit how much of this price increase can be passed on to consumers. Still, demand should be relatively robust, as research has shown consumers tend to treat themselves to smaller and lower cost indulgences even during difficult economic times.
So I guess I can expect my sweet tooth and chocolate cravings to cost a little bit more this year. Switching sectors now, I know there have been some production challenges for fruit and vegetable growers this past year. So what is the impact and outlook for the fruit and vegetable preserving and specialty food sector?
Yes, unpacking this outlook for this sector is worth the time, given it encompasses diverse subsectors, including fruit and vegetable canning, pickling, drying, frozen food manufacturing, which includes frozen fruits and vegetables, frozen dinner, side dishes, and frozen pizzas, just to name a few. We can see on the screen here is that both GDP growth and changes in volume of products sold over the last 4 years and our forecast for this year. You can see the inverse relationship between economic growth and volume sold. In 2021, when households had more savings and disposable income due to fewer options to spend their money, sales declined as consumers opted for fresh produce over frozen. However, this trend reversed in 2022, with consumers looking for ways to save money in this tough economic environment. For 2024, we are forecasting meager GDP growth of only 0.7%, which should provide a boost to manufacturers in this sector, with our forecast of 5.1% increase in sales. A big motivator in consumers substituting fresh and canned food over fresh is saving money by preventing food waste. According to a 2022 survey, nearly 50% of respondents shifted from fresh to frozen products to save money. Fresh fruit and vegetables in Canada account for nearly 45% of food waste. By switching to preserved fruits and vegetables, consumers could save money in the long run by reducing food waste. Still, we expect margins will be tight this year. There will be stiff competition from private label canned and frozen goods, and in addition, raw input costs, packaging costs, and higher wages will collectively increase slightly more than sales, limiting margin improvement in 2024.
So we talked about some sectors that are inputs to the bakery and tortilla manufacturing. So given what we've discussed so far, what are you seeing this year for bakeries and tortilla manufacturing?
Yeah, you're correct. Flour prices increased sharply over the last couple of years due to a small Canadian wheat crop in 2021, high global wheat prices, and higher production costs for flour mills. Different wheat varieties are used for different purposes, with durum primarily used in pasta, hard red spring wheat in bread, and soft red winter wheat in cookies, crackers, and cakes. As you can see on the screen, prices for all these varieties have retreated significantly from their 2022 highs, most notably soft red winter wheat, where prices are now in line with 2020. Durum prices, however, are still 92% higher than in 2020 due to poor production in key North American growing regions this past year. Despite drought concerns, last year was better than expected year of production of major wheat varieties used in baked goods. However, lower wheat prices last year did not translate into lower selling prices for flour mills. We do expect lower selling prices later this year, as it can take 6 to 12 months for wheat price changes to flow through the supply chain and impact flour prices. The outlook for other ingredients is mixed. Classified butter, used as an ingredient in further processing, so not retail butter, declined 25% last year. The price of this butter is based on U.S. prices, which are expected to remain relatively flat this year. Given the price outlook for sugar and cocoa, which I discussed already, it will be a tighter year for bakeries producing sweet products. Declining flour prices this year will lower raw input costs and decrease bakery and tortilla manufacturing selling prices by the end of the year. This will allow for more volumes to be shipped and provide a small boost to profitability. However, margins will remain below 2021 levels.
Let's switch gears now and talk a little bit about dairy product manufacturing. As we all know, the dairy industry in Canada is supply managed, which is designed to balance supply and demand. Given this structure, how is the dairy product manufacturing industry expected to perform this year?
Correct. Dairy product manufacturing is different from other industries in that the supply of their raw inputs, which is the milk produced on farms, falls under supply management. Because of this, we get a sense of anticipated manufacturing demand when additional production announcements are made at the primary producer level. In both Eastern and Western Canada, announcements were made between December and February for additional milk production given anticipated processor demand. Our forecasts reflect this anticipated demand, with sales expected to grow by 6.5% this year. As you can see on the screen, this past year's sale performance was mixed across product type due to differences in consumer demand. Ice cream consumption, for example, was up 5.8% last year, while butter consumption was down 5%. It is also worth noting that dairy products remained price competitive last year. Milk and cheese, for example, increased 1.9% and 2.4% respectively, both below the increase in total grocery prices, which rose 4.7%, and many of the other major food products as well. This year, dairy product price inflation is forecast to slow down as well. This positions dairy products to have a relative price advantage in the grocery aisle, which is supportive of demand. Some of this is a reflection of the small increase in the price of milk, with milk costs increasing May 1st, when the butter support price will increase the average butter price by 1.3%. Overall, margins for the dairy product manufacturing sector will improve this year, though they will remain lower than the levels between 2019 and 2022.
In the FCC Economic Outlook event this past January, you discussed the challenging year it was for both the drought-stricken cattle producers here in Canada and south of the border, as well as the hog industry in Canada. Have these industry issues been resolved, and what are the prospects for meat product manufacturing this year?
First, to start off, I want to highlight that the meat product manufacturing sector comprises the slaughtering of cattle, hogs, and poultry, as well as preparing processed meats and meat byproducts. Given the sector's diversity, there's a lot to consider when examining the numbers in aggregate. As you mentioned, after several years of drought, the U.S. cattle herd at the end of 2023 was at the lowest level in 60 years. And as you can see on the screen, the Canadian cattle herd is at the lowest level in 35 years. The continued drought of the last 3 years has resulted in herd reduction, with ranchers having limited feed to keep cattle around. Many cows and heifers have been sent to slaughter earlier than usual, and with cattle prices closing 29% higher than at the beginning of the year, the incentive to sell when there's little feed available was and still is strong. High cattle prices are typically a signal for producers to rebuild their herd to meet demand. However, due to the drought and a variety of other factors, what you can see on the screen is that this isn't going to happen anytime soon, as the number of replacement heifers going to slaughter as of January 1st this year was the highest in nearly 15 years. This is a sign that the shortage of cattle will likely be around for multiple years. Overall, low cattle inventories will keep the availability of cattle scarce and prices high. Due to high retail prices, domestic beef demand faces challenges, but has been surprisingly resilient to date. Beef exports will continue to benefit from a strong U.S. economy and a low Canadian dollar. As we move on to the pork processing sector, this sector has been under duress for the last 3 years. As you can see on the screen, the pork sector ramped up production starting in 2015 and with it peaking in 2018 to meet export demand from China due to African swine fever outbreak in that country. When Chinese production returned to normal, that export market dried up. As a result, multiple pork plants have closed in the last 18 months, and capacity has been reduced at others, particularly in Eastern Canada. Last year, the number of hogs slaughtered in Eastern Canada was down 1.6%, although in Western Canada, slaughter numbers were up 3.7%. Primary producers and processors are trying to alleviate the glut of hogs, and there are signs that this is starting to bear fruit. Current hog inventories are down 2.6% compared to last year, and 4% lower than compared to 2022. While the domestic pork sales outlook is positive, given pork's relative price advantage at the supermarket, exports will struggle this year as the industry continues to adjust to the glut of hogs and reduce processing capacity, but the low dollar is providing some support. Let's move on to poultry, which remains the most popular meat protein choice. But the poultry sector is also facing some challenges. Recent farm gate price increases will pressure manufacturers' raw input costs. At the same time, frozen chicken stocks are at a record high. Chicken demand needs to pick up to absorb the increased production from last year, higher imports, and current high levels of stocks. In aggregate, for the meat processing sector, margins will improve this year compared to last, but the results will differ greatly depending on the type of meat and region. Pork processing margins will improve, but relative a difficult 2023. Beef processor margins will be positive, but competition for live cattle will remain fierce for the foreseeable future, given the small size of the North American cattle herd, while poultry processors must deal with the high levels of frozen inventory and flatlining demand.
So now we get to the last food sector before moving on to beverages. Given the high food inflation, tightening household budgets, and that seafood is often viewed as more of an indulgence compared to other meat products, what is the outlook for the seafood product manufacturing industry this year?
While seafood product sales have decreased in the last 2 years, they are poised for a rebound in 2024. FCC economic forecasts sales to increase 17.5%, with volumes increasing 13.8% this year, which will be impressive growth, but still lower than 2021. Declining sales and profitability in the last 2 years have led to some contraction in seafood processing. As a result, last year, employment fell by 2,500 people, or 15.4%. The only sector covered in this report where employment growth was negative. Some large plants in Atlantic Canada closed last year, causing the largest unemployment losses. Due to domestic challenges, including logistics, the seafood sector relies on exports. In 2023, 86% of sales were from exports, the highest of any sector covered in this report. As the economic health and changing tastes of importing countries change, so does the sector's health. The US and China account for roughly 70% of Canadian seafood exports by volume and 80% by value. A major reason sales have fallen in the last couple of years is snow crab prices have fallen since 2021. When we looked at detailed trade data, we see frozen snow crab was the second largest seafood export by value and volume in 2023. However, as prices go, as you can see on the screen, after rising 54% in 2021, snow crab prices fell 15% in 2022 and another 43% last year. Part of the reason was due to production issues in Newfoundland last year, as a dispute between fishermen and processors delayed the start of the harvest season. However, according to the Food and Agriculture Organization outlook, the supplies of king crab will be tight this coming year, or at least in North America. Conversely, the situation for snow crab is the opposite, as landings are good and prices seem to be on the way up. As well, most markets seem to be willing to accept substituting king crab with snow crab. So overall, demand for both king crab and snow crab is strong and growing, especially in China, which will support exports to that country. So to summarize, seafood product sales are highly cyclical, and this year the sector is due for a rebound, with exports to the US and China leading the way. As a result, sales and margins look much better this year than last.
So now we move on to the beverage manufacturing sector. While I realize that the sector includes both alcoholic and non-alcoholic beverages, I have heard that consumer preferences are changing, and there were some significant challenges impacting wineries in BC. What are some of the trends that we're seeing in alcoholic beverage consumption, and how is this impacting this sector?
The story here is really a decline in alcohol consumption, both on a per capita basis and in aggregate. We mentioned at the beginning of the webinar how consumer spending at pubs and bars hasn't recovered from the pandemic. Total sales, including the impacts of inflation, were 16% lower in 2023 than compared to 2019, even with the large increase in population we've seen during that time. Most beverage manufacturers had a challenging 2023. As you can see in the table on the screen, there were sales growth in each subsector, with the exception of wineries, as you mentioned, which fell 24.7%. However, when we consider the impact of inflation on sales, we see that volumes are estimated to have fallen across the different subsectors, with the exception of distilleries, which increased 8.8%. It should be noted that distilleries rebounded in 2023 after 3 consecutive years of declining sales and volume from 2020 to 2022, and distillery volumes in 2023 are estimated to be 15% lower than compared to 2019. As you alluded to, a series of unfortunate events has severely impacted the wine industry in the last 18 months. This is particularly true for BC wineries. Despite loosening pandemic restrictions, tourism last year did not return to pre-pandemic levels as forest fire risk and smoke kept some tourists away. And there have been back-to-back winters where extreme cold has damaged grapevines. Given this, the outlook for wineries this year looks quite problematic. This year, we were forecasting beverage sales to decline 6%, with volumes being 3.3% lower. This would be the third consecutive year of declining volume for the sector. Alcoholic beverage sales and volumes of all types are forecast to decrease this year, while soft drink and ice manufacturing sales should increase. That's not to say there aren't pockets of growth. The non-alcoholic beverage market will diversify and grow as the sober curious movement continues to grow. Producing and marketing non-alcoholic drinks requires significantly less red tape and taxes. Alternative alcoholic beverages such as seltzers, coolers, and ciders will continue to provide another avenue of diversification and growth. This is true for distilleries providing hard liquor and breweries with the production lines to assemble. Over the last 5 years, sales of ciders and coolers by volume have increased 15.5% annually on average.
Well, that is the end of our video here today. There sure was a lot to cover, so for more detailed information on each of these sectors, make sure you check out the entire food and beverage report that is posted on FCC's website. Thank you all for joining us, and a special thanks to Des for all your insights here today.
You're welcome, and thank you very much for having me.